Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Inc. And for this week's writing tips, we're going to be doing the third part in our series of elements of style. We're going to be talking about conflict. So the first thing that I want to do when I'm talking about conflict is I want to talk about the 6 different kind of recognized storytelling conflicts. And we're going to talk a little bit about what they are and give you some examples of what they, where you see them in fiction. So the first one is man versus self. So this is about internal conflict. So a character having issues with their morality or questioning their beliefs or having a moral conflict or their self-image is not what they thought it was. How they view themselves is different. They're having an existential crisis or they have personal feelings that they're trying to deal with. So Fight Club is a good example. We have a character who is pretty much internalizing some of his issues, to say the least. And you don't really know that until the end, and if you haven't seen it, I'm spoiler alert, because seriously, you should have seen it by now. But it is man versus himself, essentially. Fat Angie, a book that I've talked about before, is about a character who is struggling with her own self-image and her role within this world that tells her that she is fat and she is worthless and that she's not special, that her sister was special, but she is not because of how she looks. And that is a character who's struggling with themselves. There's a really good book called Believe Anorexic, which is a character with an eating disorder, kind of a memoir almost, but in poetry form of the author, and that is man or woman versus themselves. I think Hamlet also probably falls into this category. Just the constant internal struggle. A character who's fighting their faith, or they're not sure what they believe anymore, or they're going through a midlife crisis. All of those things kind of fall under this category, right? The second one is man versus man. And this one's kind of the classic one that we think of a lot of times when we think of conflict. We think of Batman versus Joker, right? And these two characters who are polar opposites, who are fighting one another or are mirrors to one another. They are opposing desires or interests. So a lot of the superheroes and their villains are that way. Fat Angie, again, also has that conflict within it because of the mother character, who's actually a pretty terrible and neglectful mother, who's got all of these opposing views to what she thinks Angie should be like as opposed to what Angie actually believes she is like. And so they are constantly butting heads. Another one I think of is Jacob Have I Loved, where the main character has a very negative idea of who she is. She is considered the ugly twin, or she believes herself to be the ugly twin. Her sister had more health problems when she was little, so she got more attention, and this has created a bitterness within this character, and it's ruined her relationship with her sister because she has such a resentment towards her. And even though that character is not an antagonistic character, so it's not Batman versus Joker, that girl's just living her life unaware of how her sister really feels. It's still, that conflict is there, right? The third one is man versus society. You see this one a lot in dystopian novels, right? It's a conflict between the character and what society expects or desires of them. So the popular one that's out right now is The Handmaid's Tale. You thought I was going to say Hunger Games. Hunger Games actually fits in here too, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the Handmaid's Tale, because we have a society that's been built up. There are characters that are forced to do things that they don't want to do, not even necessarily believe in, but they are required to do it because societal expectations and laws and all that stuff are in place. And so the character's fighting against those things and against the societal expectations. It doesn't have to be that extreme, obviously. It could be something smaller. I had read a book years ago, and I cannot remember the title title, where the character is Indian American. Her parents expected her to be a doctor or an accountant, and she wanted to be an artist. And it's a fictional story, but she really struggles with her parents' expectations and them wanting her to have an arranged marriage because that was normal in their culture, but that's not normal to her American culture that she has grown up in. And so she's really kind of fighting this constant battle with the cultural expectations of her while also being herself, right? And doing what she wants to do. The fourth one is Man versus Nature. Typically, when I think of Man versus Nature, I think of Jack London books. Because all of his books take place with like either animals or people freezing to death in the tundra of Alaska. So I think of his books first when I think of Man versus Nature. This is simple. It's people who are tormented by natural forces such as storms or animals. Now, how that plays out in books is wildly different because it doesn't always have to be animals. But Life of Pi is a good example of a man versus nature. Also, man versus himself. But we'll talk a little bit about the crossovers in a minute. There's a really good book that I read called Upside Down in the Middle of Nowhere about Hurricane Katrina, and it's a middle grade book about a little girl who survives Hurricane Katrina and the struggle that she goes to, and she ends up at the Superdome at one point, and that it is all man versus nature. And yet there's of course a character arc and all these other rich things within the story, but that is the main conflict that kind of carries the plot through, and that's kind of what your conflict is it's kind of creating a bit of that plot that you need. The fifth one is Man versus Technology. So this is, of course, highlights the problems with technology as it grows and becomes more intensified in our current world. I think of I think of things like Terminator and The Matrix. It doesn't have to be that intense, but of course, obviously, most of this is sci-fi books. Cory Doctorow's little brother, that one hits a little close to home, just so you know. But that one's a really good example of kind of a twist on 1984 and Big Brother's watching, but Little Brother's watching, and technology. Feed is also a really good one. That one's very sci-fi, but everybody has a feed in their head that gives them information and tells them, what to buy and what new things are in fashion. And one of the characters purposely is messing up her feed. So if you think of it as like a social media feed, purposely going to like websites that she doesn't care anything about just to throw off the formula and the algorithm. And so she's doing that with the feed in her head, and it kind of bites her in the butt in the end. And so and it's very creepy, and you're like, ooh, oh boy. And there are moments where I think with any good book, you think about them afterwards, and things will happen, and you'll be like, ooh, I hope that doesn't happen. And the last one is, number 6, is Man versus Fate, or Man versus the Supernatural. So these are typically quest fantasies a lot of times, or books with prophecies. Lord of the Rings is a good example of those, character going off on a quest. They have to fulfill a destiny. Clash of the Titans is a really good one because there's this idea of like the fates and prophecies, so that the character has to go do something, and that they're going to be the one to change the world. Again, doesn't have to be that crazy and big. The Outsiders is actually Man versus Fate, because the characters in The Outsiders, the greasers, are expected to have certain life outcomes, and they're expected to act a certain way, and they're expected to do a certain thing. And when the characters go against that, it throws people off, and even the characters themselves struggle with an internal conflict because of those things. Stranger Than Fiction is a really fun one that is man versus fate, because you have a character in the book who becomes aware that his book is being written by a narrator and an actual author in the real world. And so how much control does he have if there is a person who is controlling him? And that's a really interesting, almost existential way of looking at a man versus fate. So you can have fun with any of these. So it doesn't have to be Batman versus the Joker, right? It can be so much more nuanced than that. So one of the things that you can do, of course, is I would say that everybody needs to have more than one of these in there, because although one of those works, it really, to have like several of these kind of, and not all of them obviously, but you know, I talked about man versus nature and Upside Down in the Middle of Nowhere, where you have a character who is fighting against nature, but she's also fighting against herself because she's not sure if she's strong enough to do this and to get through this and to keep her family together. And so she's constantly fighting herself and making sure that within this big circumstance, we've got the secondary subplot of a character who is trying to keep her family together. And I think that those two together, married together, work so well together and create this really kind of deep and rich story. So you're rooting not just for the character, but you're also rooting for them to get through the nature element of it. It's also, you can have different characters who have different things that they're fighting against. You know, I talked about Jacob Have I Loved, where the main character is man versus man. But her sister doesn't have the same animosity and is almost clueless as to the resentment that is building in her sister. And so that character has a very different story arc and conflict that is ongoing. So I want to be clear that conflict helps with the plot and it kind of builds the plot. Book set in World War II is not a plot. Character who is struggling against the forces because he's been conscripted and doesn't want to join the army, and he's terrified that he's going to be killed, that's a plot. right? So then you can build on that. It's very hard to put a character into a situation if you haven't created some kind of conflict points. So the next thing you have to do is you have to build in a cause and effect. Okay, so once you have decided which of these kind of main conflicts you're going to use, then you have to have a cause and effect. We have to know, the reader needs to know what's going to happen. What are the stakes? Make them believable, right? And then you also have to make sure that at least one character in the book deals with the consequences of those stakes. If the stakes are, I could die if I go fight, then we need to see people die. And we need to see people who are close to the main character die, because that raises the stakes and it allows our character to interact with the world and make the conflict greater, right? Oh my gosh. You know, and you'll see that they do this a lot in war movies where like a best friend dies, right? Which is believable. That happened a lot. Building those stakes in there so that the character is even more scared of what's going to happen is really important. Again, they don't have to be really high stakes. I'm not saying that we have to like change society like The Handmaid's Tale. It could be something a little bit smaller, but the stakes still need to be there. What happens if this character doesn't figure out who they are? What if this character allows their parent to control them? You know, and it's okay if the ending's not happy. What if they never figure it out? What are the stakes of that? And then build the conflict within that, right? You need to show us the cost, basically. I see a lot of new authors who really struggle with this. Like, they don't struggle with the conflict necessarily, but they do struggle with the stakes and making them high enough and believable that we are concerned for the character. We're concerned that they may not achieve the goal. They may not get the thing that they want in the end. And that is one of the main reasons why I know when a book is a part of a series, because lately they don't tell you, they don't put the numbers on the side. So you just like, you get about 3/4 of the way through the book and you're like, this is not wrapping up. The stakes were set up, and I don't think it's gonna end with the character figuring it out, which tells me that there's gonna be another book. So if you so you also, if you're thinking about writing a series, you have to make those stakes high enough, not only for one book, but a series, right? Then you have to include secondary characters, and you have to have their related conflicts within. Your secondary plot points add to those conflicts. So you can have the man versus nature, and then the man versus man, or you can have your man versus society. Hunger Games is man versus society, but it's also man versus self, because Katniss is constantly dealing with an internal struggle within herself. But we've also got the other two characters that she's in love with, and we've got their storylines and what they're struggling with themselves. And we've also got a whole bunch of other secondary characters who have internal struggles. And so that's how you start building these layers and creating kind of this rich story of having these different conflicts. Don't be tempted that if you're writing for younger readers to only have one conflict. I mean, it doesn't matter that there should be multiple things within a story to create the conflict. And then you need to detail the complications. So you build this world, you add the details, you add the conflict, and then you use those details to kind of make those plots richer. So I think of The Giver, and I know this sounds very analogous. So The Giver with Jonas is the characters at the beginning, and Jonas can't see color, right? It's part of the medications that they take. And then as the story progresses, and he is revealed more information, he gets to see more color, which adds more to the conflict, because he's like, what all have I been missing? And what are all these people missing? Why did we do this? Like, this is crazy. So it's mirroring the character's journey by adding that detail and element into the story. When you think about The Handmaid's Tale, the first thing you'd probably think of are the hats and the red capes. That is a detail within the story that adds to the conflict, and it adds a almost foreboding feeling when you're watching the show, when you're reading the book. And so those are the little details that you want to add to the conflict within your story and make it more rich, and then make your character struggle more, and then raises the stakes, right? So what happens if they take off this cape and this hat? What happens when you can see color? And how do you reveal that to other people? What happens? So those are the main 6 conflict points. I'm sure you could add more in there, but those are the ones that are kind of the more commonly used. And if you Google these, you'll find them kind of out there in the world with lots of examples and ways that you can write them. I challenge you that if you're looking for a little bit of a fun writing exercise, is to pick one of those 6 that I mentioned and that you don't normally write in, and try writing a story in it. Try to write a short story with a conflict that you don't normally tell, because that's always a little bit of a challenge, but it also might get you really thinking about some of these other conflict points that you don't think of, and help you build a plot. Because in the end, that's what your conflict points should be doing. They should be helping you to build a plot within a framework of the story that you're telling. Don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. If you think you're ready to hire an editor, you can visit me at galaxy-inc.com. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.